All right, we're set to go. Good evening, everyone. Tonight is a work session of the South Kingstown Planning Board. The date is Tuesday, March 14th, 2023. It is about 7 minutes past 7. We'll do roll call. Joe Murphy.
Here.
Susan Axelrod.
Here.
Paul Jordan is absent. Liz Carp.
Here.
Robin Pothier.
Here.
Peter DiStefano is absent, and Maria Mack is here. Our first item on the agenda is signage regulations, discussion on possible updates and timeline for updates, internally illuminated signage, Article 8 signs. Jamie?
So, thank you, Maria. Just with regard to the subject matter of this, I know it was discussed at length at the last workshop, and I don't want to say it became complicated, but staff was trying to uncomplicate it in the initial discussion. I think the initial subject matter was specific to a provision contained within the zoning regulations with regards to internally illuminated signs. And the only place that internally illuminated signs are, by lack of reference to them, is within the commercial downtown. So our initial take was based on feedback from residents, elected officials, and other members of government that some recently internally illuminated signs did not receive rave reviews. So we were looking at within a section of the regulations, which is actually Section 805, signs in commercial and industrial districts. There's a very specific call out in Section B in the commercial neighborhood and mixed-use zoning districts that you can only externally illuminate signs. And there's a reference that, but shall not be illuminated. And the key there is, I think they left out a word, internally illuminated. So it says, both freestanding and wall-mounted signs may be indirectly illuminated, but shall not be illuminated. And there's a missing word there, internally illuminated. Our initial discussion was, within this section, there's a call out for just CN and mixed use. Do you want to do it to be commercial downtown, highway commercial, commercial neighborhood, and mixed use zoning districts to no longer allow internally illuminated signs? So those are the typical, we'll say, 1970, 80, 90, up through the 2000s of a opaque faced sign with an internally lit bulb. Typically it was fluorescent. Now it's LED, where if the sign is 10 by 20, the entire 10 by 20 is internally illuminated and has that glow effect. We did not initially tend to discuss, architectural details associated with those. It really was the issue of, does the planning board want to continue to allow internally illuminated signs in your downtown district and your highway commercial? So.
Jamie, I think when we discussed this at a prior meeting, there was some surprise that it was not allowed in commercial highway, but allowed in commercial downtown.
Yes.
Very
Yeah.
different in nature, and of course the commercial downtown is our main street.
Yeah, and to your point, Maria, I think if you look at the commercial downtown, 95% of the existing signage in their commercial downtown is not internally illuminated. There's maybe one or two holdbacks from earlier development, and there's only one new building that was renovated that utilized internally illuminated signs. I don't know if it was an oversight or done intentionally, but again, your quintessential New England style downtown, both in Peacedale and in Wakefield, are not internally illuminated. Those signs are not internally illuminated. If the planning board saw fit, we could have that section modified, 805B, clarified with regards to the internally illuminated sign for your review at your, we probably wouldn't have it for your next, a week from tonight. We have to post agendas in a day. We literally have to post them by Thursday. We potentially could put it together tomorrow and have it on your agenda. But again, you're receiving packets now, but we can always adjust that agenda to include it. So,
Can I ask what kind of resistance you might expect for that?
if 95% of the business owners in downtown don't have internally illuminated sign, there's 5% that do. All of those existing signs would be considered grandfathered. They would not be asked to remove them. They would be able to continue. But new signs would have to be more in like kind to what exists in the downtown.
And Jamie, at this point in time, the town, by utilizing some of the ARPA money, is trying to make a significant improvement in the look and the feel of at least our Main Street, because that has been determined to be a priority.
Yeah, the town, Maria, again, to your point, the town council has allocated it's close to $6 million of public and private sector improvements for your downtown/villages. Starting with West Kingston, part of 108, Peacedale, Wakefield, and Matunic, those 5 specific areas. How the $6 million ends up being distributed with regards to economic development initiatives in those villages, but of $9 million, they put a considerable amount into the beautification and improvement to those areas.
Anyone else? Any other thoughts? Susan?
Sounds good to me.
So can I just clarify that we would add the word internal to that section B?
Correct.
And then also, we would change something in the bottom of section C. I'm sorry. It must be, I don't know if there's a D. On the next page, may be illuminated in all industrial or commercial districts. Oh, sorry, that says internally, I'm sorry, indirectly illuminated.
Again, what we would do is clarify the fact that it's okay from a regulatory point of view to allow externally illuminated sign, the gooseneck lighting. Again, we can do one model with the halo effect and one model without, but that opaque nature of a channel lettering with a bulb inside of the channel with an opaque face would be prohibited. Correct.
And are we addressing flashing?
We already, there is a section of the regulations that clearly addresses flashing lights, scrolling lights, those are prohibited.
Forbidding it? Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so, sorry, I found where I was confused. So this is in section D on the next page. It says, such freestanding signs may be indirectly illuminated in all zoning districts and may be illuminated in all industrial or commercial districts. Does that vagueness mean
Is
that
the
that illumination?
and B freestanding?
Pardon?
So you're on,
Right below the box on the next page, where it's the sentence that starts, such freestanding signs?
yeah, it says such freestanding signs may be indirectly illuminated in all zoning districts, but may be illuminated in all industrial and commercial districts other than the commercial neighborhood. And again, the clarification there is the intent, and I think they're missing a word, is internally illuminated. Because it doesn't make sense to say you can indirectly illuminate, but may be illuminated. So it's a clarification of the intent is the gooseneck, the small spotlight, whether it's an LED bar illuminating that sign versus an internally lit backer with an opaque face.
So on that sentence there, if you eliminated the second half of the sentence so that the period went after the word districts, such freestanding signs may be indirectly illuminated in all zoning districts, period. Because I think the rest of that sentence makes it a little confusing.
Yeah, again,
we could
our
just
goal would
eliminate-
be to eliminate gray and make it as black and white as possible.
Jamie, procedurally, how would we, you said potentially it could be ready for us to review it at our regular meeting and vote on it, and what would,
So the goal would be, if we have it at your regularly scheduled meeting, you can and it's on your agenda, you would be able to make a referral to town council and ask for an order of notice for a public hearing. And that request, if we do not get it on your agenda for Tuesday, you typically don't add those to your work sessions, but it's a quick decision. But I think the sooner we get this in front of council, the better.
anything else? Everyone okay with that? All right, let's move on to the next agenda item. Mixed-use development, form-based code, architectural. A very broad category.
So under that subject heading, I think we spent a significant amount of time over the last few meetings talking about the potential evaluation of Old Tower Hill Road and part of Main Street, and then, a little bit north on 108 and a little bit east on 108 also, or west and east. In doing that, I think in expanding that discussion with preparing the scope of services, we talked about kind of density, we talked about architecture, we talked about height, we talked about infill, we talked about the mixed-use components. We need to be clear in the scope of services, and I have a fairly well vetted draft that discussion with the consultant also looks at the impact to kind of water quality and stormwater management and the footprint it has on the environment. Understanding that if you're proposing to increase density, in all likelihood, there's two ways to do it. And if you remember, we talked about the vertical increase of density or the horizontal increase of density. On a larger lot, if you have a 2-acre site and you're looking for a 40,000 square foot of gross leasable area, you can do that many ways. You could do that in a 10,000 square foot building 4 stories high, which leaves you a little over 1 3/4 acres to fit your parking and your stormwater. But if someone proposes to do 1 story, which is almost 1 acre, you have 1 acre left. So I think there needs to be a discussion with the consultant that they have the conversation with the planning board, understanding that whether you go vertically or horizontally, you still have the regulatory, use a planning word, oomph, or power, to have some insight into how stormwater and water quality is handled. I think a lot of times commissions get caught up with pervious pavers, and as you get denser, in most aspects, if you can do surface treatment, you're better than doing underground. But if you're looking for density, your land area for above ground is diminished, and most aspects you're looking at subsurface storage and subsurface infiltration, because you just don't want to push that water downstream without metering it. But there needs to be a section or 10 pages or some discussion on that throughout the process, so that it's not just about building footprint, parking, architecture, without looking at the environmental side.
And as folks may know, there's already an issue with TMDL in that entire corridor. I don't know if Jay or Jamie want to expand on that and what actions could be taken in terms of future design to help to remedy that.
Can we clarify what TMDL is?
Total maximum daily load.
Oh.
So again, the key is if we'll use the Bank of America site, and potentially that's a bad site to use it, because that's almost 100% impervious surface. So we'll just use a number that has a total daily load of 1,000 gallons. You can build vertically on that with a parking lot and very successfully reduce the load with stormwater management and meter that load. So if you get a 2-inch rainstorm, it is just not into a catch basin and out the same pipe that it always went out. That actual raindrop would be either stored with part of it infiltrating and then part of it being metered out into the stormwater system. So it's a net decrease in volume and volume, velocity, and duration of that storm event.
And the addition of green space throughout that corridor would also help with infiltration, because currently there's very little planting, and it's
Which I see as the only benefit to building up, because, building up, you can shade your neighbor, but if you can leave more ground space, and that needs to be described precisely that, okay, you're up, but there has to be a certain amount of sponge left.
Yeah, and I think, again, with a good consultant on board and looking also at the marketing side and, just use an example. If the marketplace said there's the availability of another 1 million square feet of gross leasable area, 1 million square feet is a lot. But you could do that, to Robin's point, a lot of different ways. You could go vertical with that, and then that, if you're looking at 4-story buildings, that 1 million square feet can be accomplished in 250,000 square feet of footprint. But if you don't like 4-story buildings and you still want 1 million square feet and you only want 2-story buildings, then you're looking at 500,000 square feet of footprint. So through the visual analysis with the consultant, there will be discussions and trade-offs. And I am not advocating that there's 1 million square feet of gross leasable area that needs to be added to the town, but I think a lot of municipalities do this analysis without an understanding of the marketplace. And if you can understand the marketplace, you can potentially design your regulations to fit the market and the demand so something actually gets built.
And we certainly can expect more rain to be coming, and I think that ground space is really going to be worth settling for higher buildings.
So can I ask you, do we have any present restrictions on lot coverage?
South Kingston's somewhat interesting in most of your commercial areas that you do not have a minimum lot area for building coverage.
So you could potentially pave your entire lot corner to corner and put a building in the middle, and that would be within our regulations?
Again,
Jamie.
and just before Jay answers, I literally would like to enter the discussion of moving forward, not looking at what you have. Look at
what you'd like it to be.
look at what you would like it to be. So you're literally, it's almost playing Sim City, where you're starting with no development. What do you want it to look like? What character of a neighborhood are you trying? Because to me, it's not just the street of Old Tower Hill. It's Old Tower Hill and what abuts it on the backside. So it's a much bigger area than just the intersection of 2 streets. But from that, there are a number, find out what you want it to look like, and we can back into the regulatory aspects of that. And it can be accomplished many different ways. It can be, I showed you floor area ratio last month. You could do it with a form-based code. You could do it with a hybrid of form-based and floor area ratio. You could do it with a Martin zoning code. There are multiple ways to do it, but try to enter it with an open mind of I don't want a single lot with more than 50% building. I don't know what that looks like, because someone could do something that you don't like that still meets that simple regulatory dimension. So to me, it's find out what you want, back into that from the regulatory side.
But, I think your question is valid in that it's important to understand that this, as it currently exists in terms of zoning, what is the trigger for, say, perimeter parking lot landscaping.
Number of spaces, anything over 5, or a retrofit of an existing parking lot where you affect more than 5.
Like a reuse scenario.
Yeah. But if the Bank of America site was just going from a bank to a restaurant and they weren't changing anything, you get what you get.
So that's under our current zoning.
I know Jay was,
But if I bought an acre of forested land, I guess part of what I was wondering is, what do we have right now for built-in green space on the development of a virgin piece of land, not a redevelopment of something that's there that's already paved? But if we were interested in more green space downtown, do we need to have something built into the regulations that makes it happen for new development? And I'm not trying to look back, and I'm not, I don't want to imply that I'm pointing any fingers at what's there, but moving forward, what do we have that protects that need for, if we value that green space, that ensures that it's built into the system?
so I think what you're making a decision on is that 1 acre, and again, it doesn't exist, I'm not aware it exists in downtown, where you have a 1 acre forested piece of property that's left. We'll use that scenario. When you're evaluating your zoning, you're gonna make decisions that you're gonna allow potentially more dense development to occur in specific areas. And your trade-off is other areas in town stay green because you've concentrated your growth in a specific area. If your goal is, and it's hard to do it in isolation, but if you had 10 1-acre lots in a row, and you wrote a code that said only 50% of that lot could be developed and the other 50% needed to be forested, you just took 10 acres of developable land in your highway, commercial, or your downtown corridor and only made 5 acres developable. But remember where you're trying to do this, in your downtown commercial corridor. So I think you're trying to make development look like things that already exist there and maybe more dense. I don't think there's enough land area where you're taking a boundary between existing residential and existing commercial and changing that boundary.
And this is where I think having a consultant come in that has created this kind of zoning overlay, or whatever you want to call it, in other communities would be really helpful, because we can see before and after photos. And of course, in terms of the green space or landscaping, that would obviously be part of the regulatory process moving forward. And it's, it's multiple values. Yes, it's aesthetics, but it's also allows for infiltration, and it also helps to mitigate the heat island effect, which is definitely an issue in that entire corridor.
So does the town have any green corridor sketches where these are areas we want to maintain a corridor? In the comprehensive community plan, there are corridors and green space and connectivity that they're looking at. They are, for most intensive purposes, associated with your residential zones outside of your urban suburban cores. So are we protecting them in our zoning ordinances? That in terms of developable space on a lot, if that lot is in the green corridor, what are we doing to preserve the corridor? What you've done in those corridors in some of the instances is they're zoned R80 versus R5000. So they're 2-acre lots in those areas versus 5,000 square foot lots. That's how zonings address them.
And there actually is, there was a Greenways, I have a copy of it, a Greenways master plan written sometime in the 1990s, but it wasn't ever really acted upon. And I think it's referenced in the comprehensive plan, and it may be something that the Conservation Commission has discussed in the past, but I'm not sure. But that's a different kind of topic.
Okay, fair enough, but I would like to see us
Really,
move
yeah.
forward on that, because once it's gone, it's gone. Right.
And I think, Jamie, I sent you a copy of the PowerPoint that Will Green used when he did his presentation to the council from his student project, which was a lot of the basis for this idea of creating this corridor. So perhaps we could get that distributed to planning board members. Again, it's just ideas, and it's a lot of, I don't know what program they use. Some of the finer points of the details of the buildings aren't really there because they were using a fairly basic program to design it, but you can get the idea. They created neighborhoods, they little districts.
Right, a developer should know that they're getting involved with our corridor ahead of time, right?
And there are advantages for them as well.
Sure, that could be a beautiful place.
I will say, when you look at those photos, though, the students were not constrained by stormwater management, parking, and other, we'll say, more realistic constraint factors associated with the development. You'll see some of the developments are not realistically parked or parked at all, and some of them don't account for stormwater management. I know at least one student who asked about that, and he was informed that he didn't need to think about that at this stage. And he said, but how do you build it without thinking about those and think outside the box?
Well, it's about being, creative and,
Stormwater management alone speaks to protecting green corridors. Never mind, service to wildlife that already live there.
and all over the state, there are efforts being made by the SNEP network. Save the Bay is very involved to take some of these areas where you have a high pollutant load running into a stream or water body, where there's a parking lot on a slope, and changing the design, capturing the pollutants, allowing green infrastructure to infiltrate those. So it's becoming the norm, although it'd be nice if we didn't have to duplicate everything and help to design it correctly.
I'd like to see what we're doing with it. Where it is and how we're protecting it.
Jay, I didn't mean to.
Just getting back to Susan's question, the zoning code includes a building coverage calculation. So if you had 10,000 square foot property and 25% building coverage, you could have a 2,500 square foot building. There is no other limitations for development on the lot. So your overall lot coverage would generally depend on how much land area you had available to accommodate stormwater at the same time, what the breakpoint is, and that's what the engineer would do. But there's, it's actually something that I really haven't broached with Jamie, but it was something I had thought about speaking with the Conservation Commission about. If there's a benefit to considering a lot coverage also, particularly in areas, particularly where we're affected by the TMDL, as a means to not necessarily be a solution, but another tool in the box to kind of help us get to a better place. But that, I have not had that conversation yet with Jamie or the Conservation Commission. I think it'd probably be worth broaching to see the likelihood of us being successful with something like that. There are a lot of parcels in town that are excessively impervious. We couldn't really do anything about them in changing the ordinance now, but we could get them through attrition over time when they come into.
We- and- and we-
One more question then. I feel like we're talking about stormwater, but we're calling it total biological load, so I'm a little confused there.
It's been a long time since I got to brush up on TMDLs, but your TMDL is, think of your nitrogen loading, a non-point source pollution. The biggest impact in this area is just Wakefield and Main Street and the intensity of development in that area that contributes to the direct runoff into the Saugatucket, which then ends up in the pond.
Okay, so
but-
stormwater picking up fertilizer or whatever and then putting it into the system.
Yeah, TMDL is the total loading of the nutrients going in at any given time. And when the nutrient loading gets too high, we end up in an excessive TMDL situation.
Yep, I see it now. Thank you.
The town has been working with the SNEP network, which stands for Southern New England Program, and they are experts on all of this. There is a project that's been going on, for a couple of years now, in the Peacedale Park. I think they have done something in Green Hill as well. But that's a very good resource. So maybe that's something that we could send a link to board members, because they have a monthly newsletter and you can see the projects they've done, but that would be, I think, very helpful in terms of understanding
Who is that from?
the SNEP network, SNEP.
Thank you.
And one of the members on our Conservation Commission, who is a researcher at URI, works exclusively on those issues.
And again, the key is as you get denser, and again, I know for some aspects, the planning board likes pervious pavers or pervious pavement. In some aspects, asphalt parking lots that go to a bioswale and bioremediation are a better mechanism for treating stormwater management than pervious pavement. If you can, if rain falls in this room, if I put it in the ground where Jay, Andy, and I are sitting versus putting it back in the ground where Susan and Robin, you're sitting, it still gets, in essence, in the same basin, same water recharge area. But if I can send it to a swale, which goes into bioremediation, which can take out some of those nutrients, although it's not pervious pavement, the other methodology may actually be better for the environment. It's not as user-friendly in terminology, because, you know, everybody likes pervious pavement and pervious pavers, but the actual water quality treatment with a solid surface to a treatment area may be better for the environment. And there's a balance between those. And, you know, you look at some areas, a lot of your areas are completely paved. Arnold Lumber, you know, everybody drives by the building and says it's great, but you have a building with roofs and a paved laydown area. There's not a lot of green space associated with Arnold Lumber. The building block, the parking behind the building block, those are fairly highly impervious areas that have to manage stormwater. So there are ways in combination of existing bioremediation and maybe in-ground infiltration or under the surface galleys and infiltration. You're going to have to find a balance for those. And again, it may not be all of one or all of the other. It's finding the balance while you're allowing the density for your commercial corridor to grow. Because most developers aren't going to take an existing footprint of a 10,000 square foot building, tear it down and redevelop it if they can put a 10,000 square foot building back. They're going to want 40 or 60 or 80 in order to buy it, reinvest in it, and then take out the parking lot and do all of the new regulatory requirements. But again, Maria has said this before. We get the right consulting team, they will articulate it, they'll be able to visualize it, and then you'll be able to determine as a planning board what you want to move forward. Correct. Yes.
require the developer to show that he can meet surface, and then he could propose something different if it's a better alternative. But he has to be able to meet that surface requirement. That would guarantee some green space.
I want to say good in philosophy.
Hey.
Difficult, so again, we'll take a 1 acre lot. So in your analysis, we use a builder's acre, 40,000 square feet. So the developer says, yeah, I can fit my building and my parking lot on half of it.
So
And-
he shows that he can meet.
He can show that he does it,
These detention basins, swales,
okay?
whatever.
And then he leaves the other half for surface treatment.
He probably wouldn't need half.
So, but I'm
Just a
I'm
lot
trying to
less
do
than
simple
that.
math. And then he comes back and says, I have a better idea. I'm gonna spend $250,000 to put it under my parking lot. I'm gonna get no increase in density. And you want me to leave where my basin was as green space. I don't know too many developers who would pick that option, except if they could get the increased density.
And that green space could also be multi-use in nature. It wouldn't necessarily be a detention pond. It could be something that's
Now instead of a detention pond, he has the open space recreational. Yes, it's gonna, he may very well not wanna do that, I get that. But so when you design a detention basin, right, you design it based on volume, right? So you base on some rainfall event, whether that's a 20-year or whatever, and how much impervious, so you base it on volume. A lot of times, we see problems with lots that have high water tables, or they have drainage problems, or they have ponding already. In a case like that, that detention basin can't be as deep because of the water table. So what this actually does is it kind of gives you somewhat a built-in protection against overdevelopment of lots where you have drainage problems already. Because where they have drainage problems already, they can't get the depth on the detention basin. They have to go larger, right? If they don't have a water problem, then they can go deeper, right? So the amount of land that they actually need is less. So it kind of is a little bit of policing of density as a somewhat, not a direct correlation, but indirect correlation with those lots that have problems with high water tables and stormwater. So if you have a lot that has high waters, you're gonna need a larger detention basin. They don't necessarily have to do that, but then they would have to leave more green
Yeah,
space.
it still is gonna affect their gross leasable area, or their area available for building and footprint.
But I don't think that Joe's the first person to have thought of this, and I think that other communities have been creative and found ways to make it work.
And my response to that, Joe, is go through the visualization of what you want the future corridor to look like. And there's gonna be some balances to that. So if you have that 40,000 square foot lot, and you like a development that supports 90,000 square feet of building on 3 stories, which only leaves 10,000 square feet left, and you're okay with that style of development, the other things will, and you still have the requirement that they gotta pre-treat their water, they gotta do nitrogen removal, all of that will find its way and course of what's the best option for both the community and the developer, and a balancing. I'm trying to try to come to the table during this process with an open mind and back into what the requirements are, so long as you're okay. I'll tell you, if a developer came to you today and asked to build the building block on the footprint of the building block, I don't think a single planning board member would vote for that, because it's 100% impervious area with no stormwater management. But everybody drives by that building every day and likes the building. You can't replicate that today in a modern permitting scheme at all. So even if someone tried to do that on a 3 acre piece, you would probably react to it's too big, and, but so find the style and density of development you want, and we'll back into the water quality management. And again, maybe there is a trade-off, and I understand the point you're trying to make, that don't just let the developer get the density bonus by picking the best thing available to them. But if you kind of pre-approve the style and density of development that you want, and maybe it's only 75% of the lot can be developed. To my point, if you had that 40,000 square foot lot and said 75% of it can be built on, 25% of it has to be green, you start from there. You're at 75% density on that lot with regards to coverage. I'm okay with 75% of it being building and 25% of it being green space. But then you gotta quantify those green spaces that it's not a 2-foot strip around unusable area.
Are you saying that that 25% includes their stormwater management?
I don't know what the number is yet, Robin. What I'm saying is go through the visualization process to determine what you feel is acceptable from a density standpoint along your most dense urban corridors in the town. Yeah,
I have a hard time thinking the way you're asking me to think.
I know it's, but just think of it this way. Arnold Lumber is literally 100% pavement and building. Would you ever write that into your regulation that you can do that? No. But yet that's the style of development in the corridor. So would you allow that to be done at that level of density if the latest stormwater quality management devices were put into that site where it improved the site? Is everybody familiar a little bit with Newport? Newport. Everybody know where the, yep. Everybody know where the post office is? Does everybody know where the post office is in Newport? Does everybody know where the skating center used to be? And every winter they put the tent up and again, they had the boat show there, and Healy Hansen had their annual warehouse sale there. Now it's Hammett's Wharf and a hotel. Has anybody driven by the hotel and said that's too big and I can't believe they paved the whole parking lot? And there's only one small water quality treatment feature that you can see, and it's directly along the shoreline. But someone decided that density of development was okay, so long as they had water quality treatment. The trade-off there is there's not a lot of, we'll say, lawn and green space, but there are public spaces. So the public, even though it's a private property, is welcome and invited into the private sector there. So there are different ways to treat public, private, open space, green space, and everything. I'm just trying to say, keep an open mind. It's your most dense corridors in town, but some of the discussion I've heard and had is that some of the things you love about downtown, you never could rebuild from a regulatory standpoint because you want 50% green space or you want only 25% lot coverage. You couldn't rebuild your downtown today. I'm not saying you want to rebuild your downtown today, but just, you know, work with the consultant and what do you want the corridor to look like?
There's also the possibility of, before we get to the point of working with a consultant, Will Green has many acquaintances who are design professionals who work for companies who do this kind of thing. And he has said that he could probably have between 1 and 3 come and speak to us and just show us what they have done on some of their projects. And that's a great way to kind of get thinking.
Sure, but I do struggle, Jamie, you often seem to be describing that we're going to come up with the building that we would say okay to. I don't ever see a developer going, oh, I'll pick that one.
It's not, I'm not saying the building, but if you take a corridor, and if you took from CBS to Route 1, and we know all the existing buildings there, the consultant should be able to show you the redevelopment of that corridor with a density, a bulk and density, height, lot coverage, size of buildings on the lot, that you can say, I kind of like that density, or no way, that's not South Kingstown, that's more Providence, that's the buildings are too big, okay? How do you scale them back? And maybe you're not offended by the height of the buildings, you're just offended by the area that the buildings take up. So you look at another analysis, to Joe's point, that, you know, a 4-story building that takes up 100% of the lot is probably not South Kingstown. Maybe a 4-story building that only takes up 1/3 of the lot next to a bunch of lots that are similar is okay and acceptable. So go through that visualization process. We're not saying you're gonna have a corridor with 20 properties and you're gonna nail down the architecture and the buildability of each of those lots, so that is exactly what has to be. You have to develop a theme, a density, a bulk that you're willing to do.
I think
Otherwise,
it's a
you're
good
just
way to
gonna let-
describe a theme, because obviously we want to see a range of building styles, different uses, different types that form a fairly cohesive kind of corridor, as Jamie's referring to, having a theme.
So what I'm visualizing when you're talking about, say, our Main Street, is the different shapes and styles of building. They're all sort of the same distance from the street. But what we're talking about on Old Tower Hill Road would be piecemeal development. So how would it be to drive along and see, you know, your McDonald's and your bank, and then a 4-story building, and then an empty lot, and then, like, it's not gonna look like you're talking about for potentially ever, or generations. And in the meantime, what are we willing to settle for this? Is it gonna look snaggletooth for decades as one at a time properties turn over to this vision that we have for the future? And that might be what we never get past, a couple of snaggletooth 4-story buildings stuck in among the car dealers and the McDonald's. And would that be acceptable? Because that's maybe more likely.
So the town was founded in 1723. Your downtown has developed over the last almost 300 years, and at some point in time, there was a 1-story building next to a 4-story building. Susan, you're not,
But you're asking us to visualize the Bell Block and how Main Street looks. It won't look like that because the guy that owns McDonald's may never be willing to
Correct.
change over that property. So it'll never become that vision of Main Street that you're asking us to picture.
Again,
And
I'm-
furthermore, that hotel situation in Newport, some might not think that that fits in with the spirit of Newport or the nautical theme or the access to the coastline that it used to have, and that it's really out of place. So it's not necessarily, I mean, someone liked it, but everyone might not like that look, that fancy-dancy, shiny brass hotel has sitting in that, on that old wharf.
there was a 10-year discussion on the redo of the park in the middle of Newport, and there are still people offended at the redo of the park by the brick marketplace, because it was historic in nature, and some felt it should never change, and others wanted to modernize it based on the uses within the community. Creating a new zoning code for this is somewhat aspirational. You're creating a code for what you want the area to be as it's redeveloped. And you are 100% correct, Susan, that the properties to the left may do it, the property to the right may do it, and the person in the middle is the gas station. And until it's no longer a gas station, nothing's going to happen there. But it doesn't mean you don't prepare for the redevelopment of every single parcel within the corridor. You should create regulations for the potential redevelopment of the mall and the shopping center, not necessarily say, I don't want to do it because they may never do it, or they'll only do part of it and we'll still have a McDonald's out front. You know, 50 years ago, we didn't have McDonald's, we didn't have Burger King. 50 years ago, there weren't, I'm going to exaggerate, 10 banks in a short distance from each other. You only had 1 or 2 in a community. You didn't have 4 fast food restaurants. You know, things evolve. Community, that's my point, 1723. It's taken a long time to get from where you were to where you are today. But the whole, what you do monthly, in some aspect, is aspirational, and you're trying to develop regulations for what you want the community to be. If someone 50 years ago did this, you'd have something different than the mall you're trying to potentially undo today. If someone did it 50 years ago, you wouldn't have the remnants You wouldn't have the remnants of 3 gas stations in downtown with 2 new ones in another area, right? So you have 5 gas, actually 6 gas stations, 3 active and 3 non-active. So you are 100% correct. It is not going to happen. You're not Mashpee Commons where someone bought 400 acres and they're building a new town. This will take, it's almost generational.
And that's why a lot of the folks who do this kind of work in the consulting world, they will say that it's important to, as you bring the public into the process and the property owners, to have someone as part of that discussion who has done this successfully, a developer, a finance person, because they can explain to property owners how it all worked and how it benefited them and the community as a whole. Because we're not trying to, are folks familiar with, again, this is residential, not commercial, Seaside and Celebration, which are
Disney World.
kind of, where they started from ground zero, planned communities and everything had a certain look and feel. So we're not trying to do the commercial version of that because we're not starting with a potato field. So we just have to be creative and as visionary as possible, I think, rather than doing nothing. And as you know, it also will create opportunities for housing, which we are in dire need of. So it's kind of a
But, you know,
multifaceted.
And I didn't want to imply that I want to do nothing, or that I'm trying to be the skunk,
I know.
or that I'm trying to be the skunk at the party. I'm just trying to imagine the vision if one guy builds one 4-story building and then nobody ever does anything again, and is that going to be okay? Like, it never, ever gets built besides that one lone tower in the middle. Is that going to be okay?
Well, Susan, that's what we have right now. That's what we have right now.
But I think,
There's no specific design guidelines. It's people come in and, hey, there's a spot in the back, let's put a self-storage facility.
Yeah.
Buy the
So-
bank, tear it down, put a gas station in.
So you're right, we're
Buy
not
a
going to,
restaurant, tear it down, put a Cumberland Farms in. You have no say or control right now. And it's not control, it's you have no say on the outcome other than a dimensional code right now. Meet a setback, meet a height, meet the use. Could be retail, could be a gas station, could be a bank. But it is happening and has happened and it's not unregulated. It's what the community decided to do. There are communities who 60 years ago developed design guidelines. You know, Hilton Head has had design guidelines in place for over 50 years. So when you drive down one of the commercial strips in Hilton Head, all the buildings are 1-story. There's no big McDonald's sign. You can't tell whether it's a fast food restaurant or a sit-down restaurant. Some of it is somewhat sterile because they actually have a color palette of very neutral colors. But other people just love the aspect that the buildings have a sense of place. You know, we're not sitting here as a planning department trying to make you look like Nantucket or make you look like anywhere else. South Kingstown has an eclectic mix of colors of the buildings, architectural styles, and again, that's happened over 300 years. It may take another 300 for everything to fully build out. You know, there may be no retail in 50 years because everyone just gets it delivered to the house.
I think a big part of it is, do your regulations change the value of the parcel for the developer? And the more value that your regulations increase, the more that your regulations increase the value, the more likely and the faster that those changes will happen. Because the developer is going to look at what his parcel and existing structure is worth versus, under the new regulation, what is the parcel alone worth? Is it worth it for me to tear down that structure and rebuild based on the new regulations? And so the more value you create that lot, the more likely and the faster those changes will happen.
Jamie, I know this is in D3, but do you want to just briefly talk about RFQ and what it means and what the timeframe,
Yeah,
sources?
there's 2 ways in essence to do proposals, and I've always been a big believer in RFQs, which are requests for qualifications, versus RFPs, which are requests for proposals. And the reason I believe in that is because in the government side, you usually have a fixed budget. So if we're undertaking this zoning code review, I know what my budget will be as a department, and it may be in the $90,000 range. So I don't need to ask for proposals and try and find a architect or firm who's mostly qualified, but they're willing to do it for 80. Everyone replying knows there's $90,000 in the budget. It's not 85, it's not 95, it's 90,000. So I want to get the most qualified consulting team willing to respond to a proposal, to be a consultant in this community, to meet a scope of services, and get the best qualified person. Under Rhode Island's bidding practices, if you do an RFQ, you're allowed to pick the most qualified firm that you feel can do the job. You select that individual, then you negotiate the contract and the final scope of services. But you have a fixed budget. We're not in the private sector where you're asking 3 architects or 3 builders to bid on your house when, you know, one builder's coming in at $1 million, another's coming in at 1.5, and another one's coming in at 1.6, and one's at 2, or a fourth one's at 2.1. You throw out the low and the high, and you're talking about 1.5. We're a homeowner who's saying, I only got $1 million. This is the house I want. Who wants to bid on it? And then you select that qualified consultant, and you negotiate the final scope and price.
I think as I mentioned before, in the federal government, I think as I mentioned last meeting, the federal government, that is the way you have to do it. You have to do an RFQ, pick the most qualified, and then only then can you negotiate. It's actually prohibited from negotiating until you select it. It's called the Brooks Act. So, from an architectural engineering standpoint, it's the only way you can.
Rhode Island, under the RFQ process, doesn't even let you ask for a price list. And anyone that submits a price list, in essence, in my view, is violating the language in the RFQ law for Rhode Island.
So Jamie, would you say that this gives us more flexibility because you can really discuss content prior to the actual cost?
Yeah, again, you really get to look at the teams, and you already know the price. The price is what budget the town has given you to do the project. So you really get to hone in on the firm, you know. And if end up you negotiate with the firm and they can't do everything you want for the price, you know, my comment to them is you submitted a proposal for an RFQ and you knew my dollar amount. When we do the RFQ, we're going to state the stated dollar amount. The town has set aside X. We'd like you to submit a proposal based on qualifications for the anticipated scope of services. And again, because I'm spread over a couple of years, there may be a phase 1 and phase 2. But to Maria's point, you do get to sit down and really pick the best team. And it's not just the lead, it's the lead and their consultants and their subs. Sometimes you got a strong lead and a really, I don't want to say weak, but weaker subcontractors. And then you look at someone who has extremely strong subs, but instead of being 100, they're a 95. I'd go with the 95 with the strong subs versus the 100 with the, you know, the 70 rated subs. And also someone who's done it before. You do an RFP, someone could submit a price for $80,000 who's never done one before. In most aspects, you're supposed to go with the lowest qualified person. They may have only done 3 or 4 or none, but they're qualified. Can you reject them? If you skip over them and pick the next person who submitted a full price offer, it becomes complicated. So, I've always liked the RFQ.
Does anyone have any more questions on this particular item?
Sorry, what's the time frame on getting this rolling?
Within the next month, as long as I don't continue to get sidetracked by other initiatives in the community.
And then do we see them as they come in, or is there just a deadline and then we all open all of them at once? And can we get to know who they are so that we can Google what they've done and, like, what's the process?
The initial vetting will be done by a committee. On this one, we'll have at least one representative from the planning board, but it's typically an internal selection until we start to negotiate with the finalists. But yeah, we'll give you the responses for everybody.
So, I'm sorry, so there's a selection committee to choose one. Who's on the committee?
We'll have members of the planning board plus internal staff. So Public Works, Parks and Rec, Town Manager's Office.
Is that an open meeting thing, or is that just,
That's typically during the day.
no, but I mean, is that public? Okay.
Can I just for a minute back up? I'm struggling to understand what you meant, Joe, when you said it comes down to what you make their property worth. Can you give me a better picture of what you mean by that?
The developer, I think, is always going to try to get the best use of their property, right? And if you're starting from scratch, it would be pretty easy to choose what the best alternative is. But in this case, you have parcels that are already developed, whether there's a small structure, a medium-sized structure, an older structure, a newer structure. And in order to make those changes, I know Susan was concerned that, well, I don't should I say concerned, but pointed out that this may never happen, right? We may want it to happen, but this may never happen. The more the changes in regulations increase the value of the lot, gives them more opportunity. Instead of doing one story, you could do 4 stories, whatever it is.
So you mean increase the value by density boost?
By density, or if there's some other regulatory change, but something where the developer can get a higher value out of that parcel. The more that changes, the more likely that those changes would be made. The more likely is that the developer would tear down that existing structure and put up something that would be allowed under new regulations. So if we increase the density, we increase the height of the building, the developer's going to look at, is it worth it for me to tear down the cost of my existing parcel plus the cost of my existing structure? Is it worth it for me to tear that down to get what I'm going to have as an empty piece of land under these new regulations, right? So if the lot and the structure is worth $400,000, but if under the new regulations, he tears it down and that lot's worth $800,000, he's going to do it, all right? Because it's going to create more value for him, and he's going to build under those new regulations.
And it's not as sort of cut and dried as size of building and density. It's also about creating multiple values and multiple uses. If you're going to create an area where you've got some housing, some restaurants, you're creating a new neighborhood. That's going to bring people into it more so than a 7-Eleven or whatever might have been there before. So you have to take that into
Right, and that's what I thought you meant, but I
Right.
knew there was more to
Yeah,
it.
so under these new regulations, I can do this, and that's worth a lot more than what my existing building and structure's worth.
In-
So,
Robin,
you.
You keep using the term density bonus. You're creating a new code for a style of development along a corridor. It's not a density bonus to individual property owners. You're gonna set a new baseline standard. So along that corridor, if you always ever only allowed 20-foot buildings with no residential above the first floor, you're not giving the developer a density bonus to do a second floor residential. You're developing a code that will allow a new baseline that allows first floor retail office and second and third floor residential. It's not a bonus. You're developing a new rule or regulation for the corridor. I don't know what that is yet, and that's why I said, go through the visualization, rendering, and density analysis to determine what that is. So it's not viewing that, if you own a property in town and it was a 1-story, 5,000 square foot real estate office, if you change the code and allow a 3-story building to be there, you're not giving Joe a density bonus. You're just developing a new standard for that corridor, which allows 3-story buildings on that lot. And by doing that, it increases the raw value of land, because we'll say a piece of raw land within the corridor is worth maybe $1 million. If you put a building on it that's generating revenue, it's probably worth $2 million. So someone to even entertain buying it, tearing it down, and redoing it is looking at a $2.5 to $3 million investment before they get a permit, because they need to buy it. While they're going through a 1 to 2 year permitting process, they may or may not be getting lease payments on that property. They have debt they're carrying, and they're already in it almost $3 million before they get any return on investment. Then it may be another $4 or $5 million to build a new building. They're in it for quite a bit. So there's a change. Now, I'll equate the value to, if you look at the mall and the Shaw Shopping Center, those properties pre-fast food had a value. If you wrote a zoning regulation that didn't allow drive-throughs, the value of that property changed because they wouldn't be targets for fast food. But because the town allowed drive-throughs, the value of those front parcels as out parcels for fast food residents increased the value of the land in general, just because of the zoning classification. You didn't give anyone a bonus. You're just allowing them to develop it at a different standard.
Jamie, just, and I know we want to leave this subject, but just a little comment. What I was struggling with when you were talking about what we wanted to look like, and we talked about, 25% open space or whatever. What I was struggling with is that under that zoning, there's actually many different land uses. You could be using that for Arnold Lumber, I just use that as a comment, or you could possibly be using that for residential, and the residential is allowed 5,000 for first unit, 1,200 for each additional unit. The amount of open space, what would be desirable, what I would see as desirable, is somewhat dependent upon the actual use and not just the zone that it's in. So very high lot coverage for something like Arnold Lumber may be fine. I mean, as long as we have some landscaping, we got some aisles to absorb the water. But if it was the residential, I'd want to see a lot more open space because I want that sense of community. I want that outdoor space where people can use it. So in that case, I might want to see good 50%, and with a community feel. So it's not just based on the zoning, but also what's the use of the zoning, which is desirable or not.
And to your point, Joe, there could be a sliding scale based on the uses, and we talked about it, I think, in one other work session about even the requirement of open space based on, especially for residential, amenities needed on site versus facilities that are built that are right around the corner from the amenities. So if you built a residential building that's across the street from a park, do you need to replicate a park on your residential property? So again, I think the discussion's great. This discussion will continue, but you'll have much more talented people at the table to continue that discussion with.
Thanks, Jamie. Anything else on this? Let's move on to status of RFQs.
With the stewardship plan, we have 2 that were submitted. I reached out today to the one that we have selected internally. I have a message in with the beta group. They appeared to be the most qualified with the most experience associated with the creation of stewardship plans.
This is for the Route 1 scenic corridor that's had scenic roadway status for several years, but a stewardship plan needs to be written in similar fashion to what was done with Ministerial Road all those years ago.
Under the next agenda item 2, EMS building, we met as an internal group today. We rated the 5 responses. There was a fairly clear number 1, and we will be reaching out to that consultant this week to bring them in and start the process of price and final scope of services.
And this is located at the corner of Ministerial and Post Road.
Correct.
We ask, so you've looked at designs of what it would look like?
we had some sample styles when we went through the vetting process with town council and with the land trust on acquiring that property. And the architectural firms that responded were aware of those. We use the terminology of kind of coastal New England being beholden to the Perryville community with regards to style. You know, one applicant put a picture of a cinder block building that already existed in town. And to that respondent, I think they missed the point that this is not a cinder block building that we are looking to replicate that already exists in town, that this is something different.
So this would be like a shingled style dormer. Do we get a preview?
Yeah, we're gonna try and, my goal in working with the consultant, along with the land trust and the town council, is to make it fit in the most appropriate manner, given the budget we have. So,
I am particularly concerned about the lighting that will be involved, because that is a dark area of town. When Singer gave that property to the land trust, she was looking to preserve.
she gave that to the land trust with no,
I understand. I've talked
restrictions.
to the land trust about this. I was good friends with Singer. We did a lot of work together. I don't think that she would want to picture a brightly lit section of Perryville suddenly blossom. Right, that was left as, an agricultural lot.
again, my goal as advising the municipality is that it should not be illuminated like a shopping center or a car dealership, which are typically bright and well illuminated, that it is residentially zoned. It is a residential area, and it needs to be residential in nature. And basically, the only lighting that should be necessary is fulfilling any safety needs.
I think isn't that commercial neighborhood right across the way, kitty corner?
No, it's all residential, existing non-conforming there, I believe. Where the repair shop is?
What was the question?
I thought it was commercial neighborhood. It was a small section of commercial neighborhood.
Yeah, that's a commercial zone.
Yeah, and the stone building across the street, my understanding, that used to be the state police barracks, in the late 1800s or 1900s. But I thought
Which
that
building? I never heard that. Which building was the barracks?
it would be kitty corner from this lot. It would be the, right on the Ministerial Old Post Road.
So the state land? Are you talking about a particular
Where the
building?
parking lot is, but just past the parking lot, just as you cross over Old Post Road to the right, that stone residential, it's probably a two-family.
Oh, yeah.
Would the entrance be on Old Post Road, or would it be on Ministerial?
On Ministerial. It's intended to be on Ministerial. And our initial lineup was so it did not affect any, directly put lights in any residential unit. So there's some opposing driveways that have residential units tucked back to the west, very far off the street. So that's where we were looking at locating our drive. I don't know if I have.
And Old Tower Hill Road, we've already discussed. So let's move on to our next agenda item, Planning Board Liaison Activities. Anything from either Liz or?
We did not have the affordable housing meeting last month. There wasn't a quorum, but we do have one Thursday night. This Thursday night, so I'll be attending that.
I did want to mention there are a lot of bills in the General Assembly right now that, if passed, will, in a very significant way, affect planning in every community. They are purported to be housing bills, but some of them will not result in housing being built. A lot of them just are disassembling our statutes that we are governed by with regard to land use. Jamie has a chart we can kind of go through, but it doesn't, there's one bill that is not, and I'll go fairly quickly, but you can look these bills up. You can see online. Sometimes the two-sentence description of the bill does not necessarily does not, almost never describe what the bill actually does. So don't go by those little two sentences, you have to actually read them. And then the first one that is not on this chart, I believe, is, it's a House Bill 5938. It's elimination of single-family zoning. And the concern, and there are many folks in the planning community, municipal planners and so on, who've started to weigh in on these things and are very concerned because obviously they know the process inside and out, and those who might submit legislation may not at all understand the unintended consequences of some of these. So this starts with 6058, but just before we do that one, so 5938 is elimination of single-family zoning. It seeks to prohibit single-family zoning in municipalities with population over 20,000, which includes SK, and mandates that those municipalities adopt zoning regulations for middle housing and single-family residential zones. And obviously, I think everyone understands that we want to broaden and expand housing opportunities in Rhode Island, but you need to do it without limiting local authority. You need to be aware of unintended consequences and stress on infrastructure, impacts to natural resources, and the physical characteristics of the neighborhoods, which have been traditionally single-family. So increasing housing density should be done in an intelligent, comprehensive way. And this bill doesn't exactly go in that direction.
It's a House bill or a Senate bill?
House, these are all House bills. I think the top one here is 8058, and this is something that we've actually discussed a little bit in the past, but not in this manner, and it has to do with a fee in lieu of, whereby an applicant can submit a fee in lieu of with an inclusionary zoning project. Say it's zoned such that they just don't have the physical space to add the units. They can submit a fee in lieu of, but this bill requires the funds to be returned or given to the state rather than to go in, something like our Affordable Housing Collaborative, which many communities have established those kind of collaboratives so that they can, over time, if the situation occurs where you have a fee in lieu of, they can build up their funds and then work together with presumably a nonprofit entity or whomever and create some affordable housing. Charlestown did this, not so much with fee in lieu of, but by creating partnerships with church community housing, I think was the name of it. So, not a great bill.
Jamie, can you send this to us?
Because they can't. 6059, you can see amends the zoning standards to make changes to the dimensional variance standards. This has a lot to do with special use permit, and it would involve, and please add to this, Jamie, Andy, Jay, a considerable amount of time and effort to reference every type of variance and how the special use permit would be applied. Am I saying that correctly?
I'm sorry. I'm not sure it's that far-reaching. I mean, it may have that effect. I think its intent was, the law already says that every special use permit is supposed to have special criteria, and a lot of them don't. And I think that's what this is a reaction to. So I think that's the intent, to simply require that the law be enforced about special use criteria. It may have unintended consequences because it throws in the words variance as well. And so it might be more difficult than it would otherwise be.
So there are many bills that have come out in what they call this housing package, and it appears that there are really 4 that are considered significantly problematic for communities and for local ability to regulate land uses within their community. Next one is 6060. I really, that's not one that, I don't know if, Andy, you want to talk about the fact that a planning board appeal would go straight to Superior Court as opposed to the zoning board of appeals.
Yeah, again, it's something that was been talked about in the past about establishing the equivalent of a land court. Rhode Island Superior Court has various special calendars. There's a business calendar. There's the juvenile calendar, not the juvenile calendar, the gun calendar and things like that. And there's been talk about a land use calendar with one judge who would know those kind of things and would handle all of that sort of stuff. Again, it's a typical legislative halfway effort. It doesn't say, it doesn't clearly say, okay, anything that's a land use matter or the housing will go there. It's just kind of taking it from the planning board. It's kind of, people complained about, well, why is there this extra step, planning board to zoning board? And so, okay, let's do away with that extra step. Let's go directly to Superior Court on the planning board.
The next one is 6061. This is one that's of fairly significant concern. It eliminates all minor subdivisions, and it replaces them with development plan review. It would be something that would be shifted from the subdivision regulations to the zoning ordinance. It's loosely defined. There's no standards. And there are concerns about the thresholds being too high for development plan review because, again, it would be administrative, which means the planning board would have no role. And then some of the thresholds in this is any number of subdivision lots and buildings under 50,000 square feet, which means that 49,999 could be reviewed with no input from the board or even from the public who might be there. Any development plan of less than 2 acres. This would all be required to be done within 25 days. And there are no findings of facts on which to base these decisions. So, and then there's more. There's a DPR review by the planning board, only 2 stages of review, preliminary and final. And as we know, final is administrative, and so we know that that would eliminate master plan, along with a public hearing. There are other criteria in this, like 100,000 square feet of floor area or less, 200,000 square feet of floor area for mixed use, multifamily of less than 50,000 square feet. No public hearing is required unless a street is created or extended. 65 days potentially to approve a 200,000 square foot development is not enough. Again, no findings. All appeals go to court. I think, potential for amendments would be to keep the minor subdivisions and create a reasonable threshold for administrative review. Reserve DPR, which is pretty much what we do for commercial use, correct?
The nuts and bolts of what's being proposed in there, the guts of it is not terrible. The thresholds on building size and total project size is problematic. I mean, the reference to 100,000 square feet, I think an average Home Depot is about 110, 120 that I looked at.
I mean,
120.
Cranston's threshold for minor land development versus major land development is 100,000 square feet. So, but, that's what they've done. It's the one-size-fits-all model of trying to apply it for the whole state. It might be good to try to, slide more things into administrative approval, but they haven't taken different communities' characterizations into account.
What about the subdivision? You said 50,000 square feet? How does that link in with the,
I think the subdivision would be 5 lots or not, because that's what the minor
what is it?
definition is. 5 lots or less is minor. So you would never see a subdivision of 5 lots or less in front of you again. Only more than 5 lots. You'd never see 1 or 2 lot subdivisions.
Provided it was conforming, provided there were no waivers, no anything. If somebody came in with a compliant subdivision, a conventional subdivision that needed no relief, that met every regulation that we have, then you wouldn't see it.
But the 5 lots would have one affordable unit built in. Isn't it more than 4 now?
6 or more.
6 or more.
So
for
5
effective zoning.
Right, and I mean, I think we would still try to enforce what we have, whereas if someone comes in 5 this year and comes in next year with another 5, we're gonna say, that's 10, and that's not a minor anymore. We would certainly still try to enforce that.
So lots of bills are introduced
Yes.
that fizzle away. Do you feel like these have enough backing and
Well,
political
look,
support?
I'll tell you one thing, look at the name, or look at the name of the sponsor.
I see it.
So I think these bills have more traction than most, than a lot of others. Will they all go through? No. And hopefully some of them can be fixed. I mean, there are some good things in there, such as there's a bill in there to give the cities and towns control over short-term rentals, which had been specifically excluded in a past bill a couple of years ago. So, there are some good elements to it as well. And I think that's our goals are to, to hopefully kill the worst, but then, improve the rest, because clearly a lot of them are going to pass.
So is
The
there-
speaker wants to take credit for his package of legislation at the end of the session. So there've got to be several of these bills passing at the end of the session.
Is there an action that we as a town need to take to stand up and protest that would be helpful?
Well, there have been, I think, 8 or 9 towns that have written letters of concern even prior to the introduction of these bills, because they are concerned about, as Andy said, the one-size-fits-all approach and the loss of local control.
Well, what about our representative? Should we?
Yeah, I mean, I would think your best bet would be to do that, to talk to your state representatives and senators. I don't think the town council, I think the towns that came out against it before it was even done did nothing to help themselves. If anything, all they did was paint big targets on themselves.
One of them, our council.
I know.
prior to-
But that's it. I think a lot of the legislators, the rank and file, there are a few, the ones on the committees and whatnot, who know about, even several on the committee. I'm sure you have members of the committee, legislative members of the committee, who have never read any of these bills. And they don't really understand them. Well, the speaker wants it, okay, we're gonna do it. So if you can sway some of those otherwise rank and file soldiers to say, wait a minute, and it's not just you, but, there's a lot of people calling them to complain about it, then they will be passing that up, and they will start digging their heels in against it and say, yes, Speaker, I know it's a bill you want, but I'm not going to get reelected if I vote for it, type thing. That's about the only thing that you can,
So
That's probably the
are
best
we
thing.
saying actually meet here in the building with
No, no,
our representative?
no.
You're saying just
you
personally?
personally, call, write. If you know them personally, that's the best, And I think,
mean, I
I think the message shouldn't be, again, that we're not against the whole project, but the speed at which this is going, a lot of them are just ill-conceived and will have unforeseen consequences.
And a town's representative should have an ear for the town's feelings and carry that forward for us.
I mean, and I think my own feeling is that an argument that many of these will have unforeseen or foreseeable even negative environmental consequences, because we're talking about this one-size-fits-all. So we're talking about it in places that don't have sewer and water, that's more of a compelling argument than loss of local control.
Capacity.
So I'm sorry to sound ignorant. Is this now in a committee somewhere, or is this all of our House representatives that are now, where does this stand in?
They've been heard by, many of these have been, but not all, have been heard by the Committee on Municipal Government.
And they're being passed on to the House for a vote, or are they?
Right now, they all start off saying they're held for study, and then sometimes at the 11th hour, they're moved forward. So I was there last Thursday, along with some other planning folks, to talk about some of these bills and recommend some amendments that would make them better. The next one, 6081, is the LOMOD Act. It changes some wording. You no longer follow a major or minor subdivision in a comprehensive permit. It creates this new category of relief from the zoning ordinance called adjustments. And I believe that we've had an attorney come before us on numerous occasions and use that word, rather than a waiver or something more specific. And it's a confusing term. It's not consistent. Only comprehensive permits would use this term. It changes the definition of infeasible to financially or logistically impractical for any applicant, which is very subjective. People can claim, well, if I can't build it for X number of dollars, then you've made it financially impractical. It also qualifies meeting local housing needs is showing that at least 20% of the units approved are LMI, and they're also mandating a density bonus of 30%. This is to market rate. So we know that we have a 25% requirement for the affordable units. Why on earth would you increase the market rate if the goal was to increase more affordable units? What should be happening is we should be saying we want 50% or some larger number requirements in these comprehensive permits, because as you know, they come in and they can ask for double, triple the density.
So this is for,
This is one of the
this is
really
for
concerning.
inclusionary, or this is for
This is for a comp permit.
so they would not hold them to 25% now, they would, once you've done the market rate bump up, where does that land? Like inclusionary ends up at 17%, where would this end up?
No, this is, so a comprehensive permit is it's supposed to be 25% affordable.
But you said there's an additional
For
market.
market rate,
So if there's a bump
mandating
up on market rate
30,
though,
right.
it's not 25% anymore, what does it become, do we know?
So look at the example of 10 houses would be allowed normally, then we'd have to do 25%, so that would be another 3, so now you'd be at 13, then you'd get 30%. Is it 30% on the base, or is it on with the affordables included? That would be another 3, so you'd go from 10 to 16.
But right now, on comp permits, you don't get a bonus.
On comp permit, you could ask for
You
whatever
can ask for
want.
anything you want.
But if they're building 12 houses, on a comp permit, we get 25% affordable. You're saying this, it's gonna change, like on
On the
inclusionary.
comprehensive, they could ask for whatever they want, 25% have to be affordable.
But what you're saying though is that there's a bonus of market rate on top of the 25%. They get some extra bonus ones that are market
Well,
rate.
this is for inclusionary, not for comprehensive, right? This would be,
She said this was comp.
This is, I believe this is for the comp permit.
so this would limit them on what the maximum amount they could ask for?
They have. If it's interpreted, yeah, right. And there are other aspects of this. Everyone understands that conceptual master plan is very general in nature, not necessarily requiring any super detailed engineering requirements, no state permits required. There's a public informational meeting associated with this. It gives everyone a general sense of the project, and it does benefit the applicant in that once they have approval, they are vested. Everyone understands that, right? They're vested in density, so that when they move to preliminary, whatever the density was, unless something major comes out at preliminary that changes that, they have that ability to move forward, having that security that they have that density. And of course, as we know, preliminaries, although it's a frequently misunderstood term, that's when you get all the details. So we also have a pre-application stage. And as everyone knows, it's an informal conversation. It helps to make the design of the project and the process overall go smoothly, because you have that conversation before an applicant has spent a lot of money. So it does save time and money. This eliminates master plan for comprehensive permits, and it doesn't require pre-application unless there's 20 lots or more. Go figure. I mean, it's really difficult to understand where some of these things came from. It also requires the application to be heard within 30 days of the certificate of completeness of an application. So I guess the question is, would there be multiple extra meetings for a board, or do other applicants get bumped? And then they also require that an LMI, all LMI units have 3 bedrooms regardless of the site or market rate units. So it does create a design constraint. I mean, what if someone was doing a mill project and wanted to do, several one-bedroom studio units? Or if someone is doing a cottage development that doesn't have cottage regulations. So and then of course the question that we've heard a lot, what's happening to the starter home? We're requiring 3 bedrooms in every comp permit for the affordable units. It just, the idea is we should be creating flexibility, not preventing creativity.
So the 30%, in most cases, wouldn't concern me because, as Andy said, that actually puts kind of a limit on it, where right now, most of the ones we see a 50 to 70% increase in density, and this would be in that range. What would concern me, 2 things. One would be that it almost requires you at that point to give them the 30%. And in areas where we identify or have been identified previously as beyond their carrying capacity, it would create problems, and we'd lose, I think, some flexibility to try to push that number down. So I think that it would be bad in areas that have been identified previously as beyond the carrying capacity. And the 3 bedrooms, to me, is also wrong. As we know, there's a need at LMI for 1 bedrooms, 2 bedrooms, 3 bedrooms, that there's a lot of people that are aging that need affordable housing, single women, single men. So those are the 2 things I really see that.
I want to skip over 6082 because Jay can speak to that, because he's done a considerable amount of research. That's an ADU bill that is, I guess, contradictory in many ways, and he's studied that quite a bit. I just want to touch upon some of the others. There is I don't know if it's on here, there's a transit-oriented development pilot project. That's a really good thing, 6084, something that's supportable. There's at least one bill with regard to notice being more unified in nature. That's not necessarily a bad thing. This next one, 6085, makes changes to the Comprehensive Planning and Land Use Act, and apparently there are 13 communities who don't have up-to-date comprehensive plans. 2 of them are in the process of receiving approval. And it's worth noting that statewide planning, the state agency tasked with community assistance and review and approval of the comprehensive plans, has been underfunded for many years and is currently at an historic low number of employees and funding. So this bill would require that communities with outdated plans beyond 12 years, that is 2 years from expiration, would be prohibited from using their plans in land use denial decisions. It also requires that the future land use map be in compliance with the comprehensive plan no more than 2 years after initial approval. Some of you may recall the adoption of a new comprehensive plan can sometimes take 2 years and a considerable amount of money. And thinking about the communities as a whole, I guess the average cost is something about around $100,000, and not every community would necessarily be able to comply with this.
Yep. Maria, on the comprehensive community plan, one of our concerns internally is the language that requires you to amend your zoning map within 2 years to be in compliance with your future land use map. Your future land use map is somewhat aspirational, so as a planner, if we were doing this, I think your future land use map in your comprehensive plan will basically just end up being your existing zoning map, because you can't promise to make changes within 2 years on an aspirational map that you want the town over the next, it's supposed to be a 10-year plan. And sometimes even those aspirational goals of rezoning something just don't occur because the Joe's talked about market conditions and other aspects that you just can't do that quickly. So if I was your planner and this was a law in place, your future land use map would look very close to your existing zoning map. Because you can't commit to a 2-year zone change that's controlled by a council. Planning board can't even control whether the areas are adopted. Only the council can do that.
Generally, after you've completed your planning board, your comprehensive plan rewrite or update, then you look at your zoning ordinance. So again, it's more time beyond that, practical and financial realities. So, there's a way to amend this and make it a little bit better. I guess the General Assembly approved some municipal technical assistance funds, but they have not been allocated, and they are within the purview of Rhode Island Housing. I'm not sure why. And, cities and towns overall, they need to have enough time and resources to comply with these things. So most communities feel as though, punitive unfunded mandates are not something that they support. Jay, do you think, would you be able to talk a little bit about the very complicated 6082, the ADU bill? Because I know you've looked at that to a certain extent in depth.
I haven't. Brian has. Brian is becoming the ADU expert in the office, so I probably wouldn't be much help in explaining that one unless.
I know that the overall sense is that it's poorly written and organized, too complicated, contains a list of standards governing optional ADUs that are very prescriptive, subjective, or restrictive. So that bill has been one of great concern. And I don't want to take up a ton of time going through every single bill, but certainly I think board members should try to read them, be aware of them.
We'll send this out, Maria. We'll send this out to everyone tomorrow.
I think that it's unrealistic to think about having enough time to address each of these on my own in terms of researching and writing a letter. I think if the planning department wanted to give us, some help in designing a letter that then I could sign my name to and send off, or at least provide the bulleted details that my letter should address. But I have no time to study this and come up with individual letters. There's got to be a better, more expedient path to this.
And the thing is that really overwhelming is that there are more than 2,000 bills up there that have been put in. So imagine your typical legislator they would need a large staff to really go through, I mean, that's an
Right,
incredible.
but a good concise letter that's been written by people who know.
I think what we could do, because this is being done by a group of planners with the ABA, as I mentioned, Brian's been working on the ADU and whatnot. And the Rhode Island chapter has submitted comments on several of the bills. And maybe, Maria, we could just get those letters to, copy those letters to the planning board members where, so they already, they've already discussing
That's a great.
what the issues are and what we recommend to change. And there's already been a process as it goes through thousands, what seems like thousands of emails as everybody, adds their comments and whatnot, but it does get distilled down to fairly succinct comments to the General Assembly about what these different bills need.
That would
The
be,
thing that's so frustrating is that they don't ask the practitioners, those who interpret and actually have to implement these regulations, for input when they're developing their bills. That's what's incredibly frustrating.
yes, it seems like a knee-jerk reaction to the housing crisis. Right. Build fast, right?
Jamie, do we have any updates from staff?
Other than our budget got passed last night, I think we talked about a number of things that are already on our plate moving forward. I will mention one other thing. We are starting to wrap up our kind of charrette process with Weston and Sampson on the 5 villages or targeted areas as part of the American Rescue Plan study. We're looking at a couple of dates where we would potentially do 2 Saturday mornings to go over those plans, and we're going to try and potentially get on the town council agenda for May 1st for a brief presentation by Weston and Sampson of where they are with that analysis as a prelude to going out to the public and seeking comments and reaction from them.
Excellent.
And
And do we have anything on recreational cannabis, since it's on the agenda?
so the
Obviously, we've weighed in on it.
So the planning board weighed in. The council did take formal action at last Monday's meeting. They did adopt a slight variation of what everybody saw. It ended up that there were 2 proposed retail areas, being South County Commons and Old Tower Hill. The council eliminated the South County Commons, and they adopted retail sales associated with Old Tower Hill. They did remove the southeast side of Old Tower Hill, basically from the substation, electrical substation, out to Route 1 on the south side. So D'Angelo's, Taco Bell, all the way up to the Chop House, that was eliminated from the zone. The north side is in Ocean State Job Lot. South side, Belmont, was in the zone. They did eliminate the bowling alley. That was roughly 480, maybe 490 feet from the perimeter of the high school property. And the regulatory review was 500 feet by state law. So they pushed that back, which eliminated the bowling alley property. From the cultivation, manufacturing, and testing, they approved 1 cultivation area for recreational marijuana that's associated with the industrial zone by the Amtrak station in the north side of Route 138. And again, that is a slightly smaller area than the entire IND 1 zone there. They also approved 3 areas for manufacturing and testing, 1 being the industrial area located directly across the street from the pump house, the Peacedale Mill area in Peacedale, and then a small IND-1 located off a high street just north of Main Street. So 1 cultivation area, 3 manufacturing and testing areas, and 1 retail area. And we'll the final maps we'll send out to the planning board.
And should an application come board, it would be reviewed by the board, redevelopment plan review?
Yes, it is all special use DPR review.
Jamie, is there anything you can share on the grant for the affordable housing? Are we going to see a...
So, also that evening, the council made final recommendations and authorization for their social service funds as well as housing. They approved 2 housing grants, one associated with the Johnny Cake Center to create 4 affordable units. They are located
Jersey Road?
off of Kersey Road.
Green Street, right?
Yeah, Kersey and Green Street.
Green Street?
Is it a conversion of existing structure, or is it...
It's either a conversion or a tear-down rebuild, but maintaining the architectural style that existed, if not improving upon it. So again, they had 1 unit that was damaged with fire, that was a duplex, and they're gonna convert that to 2 units on the first floor and 2 units on the second floor. The subsidy there was $50,000 per unit creation for a total of $200,000 to the Johnny Cake Center. They also approved $100,000 for the Housing Authority to undertake a master plan for their facilities. In the advent of utilizing more acreage of property that they own to do new housing, and then potentially raising their existing housing and replacing it with more to potentially double the amount of units that
Is
they
that
have.
both at Champagne Heights and Fournier?
Primarily Champagne Heights first and then Fournier second. They have the land area at Champagne Heights.
There's nothing else? Motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second? Second. Meeting adjourned. Thank you, everyone.